This is Thought You Ought to Know, and I'm Lewis. I'm bringing you fun facts that you didn't want to know about, but I thought you ought to know about. In the 1880s, small railroad lines were being brought up by ever-growing conglomerates. These conglomerates cornered the regional markets to the point that, because they had almost no competition, they were able to overcharge for tickets and shipping, making a pretty penny at the expense of the American people. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, which gave Congress the power to stop monopolies altogether. Since then, Sherman has been able to stop companies in all facets of American life from making money off of unfair and non-competitive business practices. Except one. I thought you ought to know that Major League Baseball is, oddly enough, the only exception to Sherman Antitrust Act. Let me tell you the story. So, baseball had been a growing sport since the Civil War, and it grew into a monetary success in the early 20th century. In 1913, the Federal League was created to compete with the successes that were the National League and the American League. Their bid in the ballpark was brief, however, as the league folded after only 3 seasons. Owners in the Federal League were jumping ship and buying up teams on the National League, but the owner of the Baltimore Terrapins was barred from buying a team. In response, he sued for conspiracy to monopolize the game of baseball. Courts disagreed on how to handle the lawsuit until it got kicked up to the Supreme Court in 1922 and was concluded in the decision known as Federal Baseball League v. National League. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that baseball did not count as interstate commerce and therefore could not be regulated under the Sherman Antitrust Act, saying the following. Essentially, SCOTUS argued that simply traveling across state lines to play baseball didn't count as interstate commerce, and therefore baseball couldn't be regulated using the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, this could be some naivete on the part of the judges, treating baseball more like a game than a business, but it's not entirely unreasonable given the time period. In the 1920s, most people weren't traveling across state lines to see a game. If you were at a Baltimore Terrapins game, chances were you were from Baltimore. This, on top of the fact that teams didn't make money during away games, was all the Supreme Court needed to side with the National League, setting precedent for the MLB's exemption from Sherman. The Major League grew in the following years, expanding across the country and garnering new revenue sources in broadcasting and merchandising. Definitely making money across state lines, and surely with all these changes, courts will have to recognize baseball as interstate commerce, right? Turns out no. In 1953, America saw the case of Toulson v. New York Yankees. George Earl Toulson was a pitcher for a Yankee-owned minor league team. Toulson was never moved up from the major leagues because the Yankees were already talent-rich, and he couldn't switch teams because of something called the reserve clause, something that every player at the time signed if they wanted to play professionally. The reserve clause gave a team a right to renew or reserve a contract at the end of the year in perpetuity regardless of the player's thoughts. This meant that teams could pay a player whatever they wanted and not have to worry that the player would join another team for better pay. This is a clear violation of antitrust laws. Despite the fact that by '53, interstate travel to see ball games was far more common and games were now broadcast across state lines, the Supreme Court fell back on the 1922 decision and decided 7-2 in favor of the Yankees. The majority opinion was, essentially, if the nature of baseball has changed since 1922, that's not our problem. Let the legislators deal with it. 20 years later, Curt Flood of the Cardinals was being traded to the Phillies. He couldn't bargain because of the reserve clause and sued the latest commissioner of baseball, Bowie Kuhn. This very similar case was carried all the way to the Supreme Court once again, and, once again, SCOTUS filed in favor of the MLB. In 1972, the court ruled 5-3 in favor of the MLB in Flood v. Kuhn. Although this time, the majority opinion held some interesting opinions. The majority characterized the precedent set by Federal Baseball Club v. National League as an anomaly. They admitted that baseball did count as interstate commerce, but refused to side with Curt Flood. The court held precedent in higher esteem than their own opinions, once again leaving it up to legislators and not the courts to decide on a court case. There was one justice, William O. Douglas, who sat on the court for both Toulson and Flood, and who reversed his opinion this time around. He voted in favor of MLB in 1953, but regretted his decision and took Flood v. Kuhn as an opportunity to right his past wrongs. One pretty significant change did come a few years later, but the courts had almost nothing to do with it. In 1975, the MLB Players Association, a union group, filed grievances on behalf of 2 pitchers who were fed up with having no bargaining power on account of the reserve clause. Again, these players, Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally, were about to be traded and were leaving professional baseball altogether in response. The lower courts decided this was a matter to be settled in arbitration, and this new change made the MLB very scared that they were going to have to pay players more money. The manager for the Dodgers said, "If Messersmith is declared a free agent, then baseball is dead." Very dramatic. And the president of the Montreal Expos personally offered McHale a $25,000 signing bonus and a $125,000 year salary. Ostensibly, this is a bribe to drop the suit. For perspective, the average player salary in 1975 was around $44,000. And it's a good thing they didn't drop the case, because in a ruling known as the Seats decision, arbitrator Peter Seats decided that the reserve clause had no legs, leading to players becoming free agents after their contracts expired. This allowed for competitive salary negotiations, and by 1980, the average salary for an MLB player more than tripled to around $143,000. So that cuts off one major advantage that the MLB got through their exemption from Sherman, but here's another one. In 1978, the NFL team, the Oakland Raiders, wanted to move to the Los Angeles Coliseum, but were barred from doing so by the other teams. The Raiders sued, and a lower court decided that the other NFL teams were violating antitrust laws, and that Oakland should be allowed to move regardless of the other team's feelings on the matter. In a very similar scenario, the Oakland A's were looking to move to San Jose in 2013, and the city of San Jose sued the MLB when they thought that the league was conspiring against the move. Ninth District Court struck down the case, citing MLB's exemption in the 1922 decision, almost 100 years prior. So the MLB is legally allowed to bully other teams into staying put, but the NFL isn't. So there you have it. Because of a strange decision by the Supreme Court in 1922, the MLB was able to underpay players for over 50 years and continues to strong-arm their own players today. As it stands, baseball is the only industry that is federally approved to ignore antitrust laws and take advantage of its business partners. Thanks for watching. I hope that was new and interesting for you. If you know something interesting that you think other people should know about, put it in the comments and maybe I'll make a video about it. Honestly, the MLB's exemption to antitrust laws isn't even the worst thing in American sports. Teams from all different leagues are constantly extorting money out of cities for newer stadiums and tax breaks under threat of packing up and heading to a new town. And I'd like to cover that in a future video.